Hey everyone, welcome. Today I want to talk about a game that I love a lot, Subnautica. Subnautica is a survival horror game that was released in 2018 and has won Game of the Year. Now, since I first watched one of my favorite YouTubers play it all the way back in 2018, I have been obsessed with this game. It's beautiful, it's got terrifying creatures like the Leviathan and Crab Squid, it's got sprawling, amazing looking biomes, and such diverse flora and fauna, you really can't take your eyes off the game. Now that's cool and all, and it's something you can learn from watching any Subnautica Let's Play, but today I want to talk about the science of this amazing game. Now the reason I do this is because since I've played the game for the first time, I've been able to go out in a real ocean, visit real kelp forests and shipwrecks and coral reefs, and learn a lot about what an actual ocean looks like. And I've gotten some of the same vibes swimming in real coral reefs that I've gotten swimming through Subnautica. And it's made me ask the question, can Subnautica teach us anything about the real world? And that's the purpose of this video. Now, the first connection we can make between Subnautica and real life are biomes. Biomes are simply just larger ecosystems. Now, just like in real life, Subnautica's vast biomes are determined by their climate, or by the various weather conditions in a certain area. We can learn more about how climate affects these biomes by simply looking out of our life pod. That's right, the first biome we see, the safe shallows, can teach us about our own world. Now, the reason the Safe Shallows teaches us about the real world is because it has a real-life counterpart, the tropical coral reef. Both biomes are full of color, full of different fish, and really warm, and that plays a key role in why these habitats are the same. See, because these are some of the shallowest regions in the oceans, both between 0 and 30 meters deep, they're also the first regions to experience light from the sun, and along with its light, also its warmth. Now, fish are cold-blooded creatures, which means they don't produce heat on their own, and heat equals energy. The less heat a fish has, the less energy it also has. Now, the less energy a fish has, the less it can put its time into evolving, simply living, or metabolizing. So, fish in deeper, darker areas that are more cold are going to have shorter lifespans and aren't going to evolve as fast. Whereas fish in these warmer regions, like the coral reef and safe shallows, are able to become colorful, evolve faster, live longer lifespans, and metabolize faster, which simply boosts the fish population in these areas. However, the fish population isn't everything. These warmer waters also allow smaller organisms and algae to thrive without being frozen. These smaller organisms and other microscopic things bring nutrients all around these warm reefs, which further biodiversity and the health of the organisms that live there. Now, we can tell this by the fact that the Safe Shallows is the only region in Subnautica that can kill the coronavirus, because the warm temperature supports the enzymes that kill off the virus. However, a warm temperature isn't exactly ideal, as we can see in another one of Subnautica's biomes, the Crash Zone. A part of Subnautica that we can only assume, because of its depth, was once a part of the Safe Shallows. What once was a stable and brimming habitat full of life is now dead, supporting no life other than the Reaper Leviathans that live there. And we see a lot of gray and decaying plant matter. This is because the Aurora crash, aside from adding a giant ship to the water, added also a lot of heat to the water. You might think this is good, given what I said earlier, but it's actually pretty bad. See, coral only lives in a certain temperature range, and when that temperature gets too high, the coral will die off in a process called coral bleaching. When coral dies, fish lose their habitat, and when the fish lose their habitat, they lose their ability to hide from predators, and things like the Reaper Leviathan will come in and take over the habitat. This is why the Reaper Leviathan is the only thing we see in the Crash Zone. This is similar to what we've seen in real life when the ozone layer protecting us from the sun's rays deteriorated over Australian reefs, causing a huge temperature spike. Since then, we've seen over 30,000 fish die, and some species have even been brought to the brink of extinction through the process of coral bleaching. Now, we have two last biomes to compare, those being Subnautica's Grand Reef and the Bethel Zone from real-life oceans. Both of these regions show what happens when you get really deep in the ocean, so far that the sun's light doesn't reach. The only light that gets down here is bioluminescence from the creatures down here, and all the creatures are either black or red in color, as down here, red reflects as black without any light. Now, as a quick disclaimer, the Bethel Zone in real life is around 1,400 meters deep, whereas the Grand Reef in Subnautica is only 200 to 500 meters deep. However, the Grand Reef does a great job at representing the Bethel Zone, And also, the game would suck if players had to dive down 1,400 meters every time they wanted to get to the Grand Reef. Now, both of these zones have no plants because the sun can't reach down to photosynthesize them, and the fish down here don't have as many nutrients. Therefore, as we learned earlier, the fish are slow to evolve, have shorter lifespans, and are slow to metabolize. They also aren't nearly as colorful because, well, the sun's light doesn't reach down here to show off their colors anyways, which leads me to the conclusion that these zones are both pretty bleak and I wouldn't want to live in either of them. Now next I'd like to talk about evolution. Tons of species on 4546b and our Earth have evolved to suit their habitats or a variety of habitats. So let's talk about a few. First we have the simple peeper, who lives throughout all the waters of 4546b. It's evolved to have a beak for defense and a huge set of eyes to see in different light conditions and levels. These fish use their speed and immaculate vision to spot and run away from predators a mile away. Next, and quite unexpectedly, we have the giant coral tubes of the safe shallows. The coral tube stands out from the rest because of its massive size, leading many to wonder how they could have grown this big. Well, that's because these corals have evolved to have a tube-like shape that allows them to catch nutrients passing through them, which in turn allows them to catch much more nutrients than most corals, and then grow to their massive size. This is really similar to how real-life coral and coral tubes get their nutrients. Moving on to the vast kelp forest, we can observe the stalker. And although it hasn't evolved to this habitat specifically, we can observe its very different cousin in Subnautica below zero, the snow stalker. The snow stalker is a land animal with fur to live in its icy glacier habitat, and the snow stalker also has the same shaped snout and spines on its back as its distant cousin, and they even share the same hunting tactics of sneaking up on their prey first, giving them both the name stalker. To further look at evolutionary habits, let's start with a staple from Subnautica below zero, the penguin, and compare it to its real-life counterpart, penguins. Just like in Below Zero, Antarctic penguins live in sub-zero conditions, and direct freezing water on their fins would make them freeze to death really quickly. So they have evolved to have waterproof and tight feathers to keep an insulating layer of air between their skin and feathers. They also have an oil gland on their tail to keep their tail waterproof as well. However, penguins in warmer climates have evolved to do something entirely different with their wings. They will flap their wings and pant, like humans, to dissipate excess heat once they get towards the equator. Another cool evolutionary fact about penguins is that they have a supraorbital gland that filters excess salt out of their system so they can ingest seawater without facing dehydration. Next, let's talk about relationships in nature and in Subnautica. In the first grade, we were taught about symbiotic relationships, or a mutually beneficial relationship between two animals. Now let's talk about mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. These three complex words are just different kinds of relationships between two organisms, not just animals. First, we've got mutualism, where two organisms mutually benefit. In Subnautica, we can observe this in the reefback leviathan and the small ecosystems on their backs. Not only does the reefback provide a safe home for the coral and the plants on its back, but this small ecosystem provides nutrients and food for the reefback. Next, we have commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is relatively unchanged. We have a great example between the player in Subnautica and brain coral. The player benefits from the oxygen created by the brain coral, and the coral is relatively unchanged and unharmed. Lastly, we have parasitism, where one organism benefits at the harm of another. There's a great example of this in Subnautica that most players tend to ignore between the player and the bleeders. The bleeders will latch onto the player and cause blood loss as it sucks out the player's blood, benefiting at the suffering of the player. We can observe many examples of these relationships in our own world as well if we look closely enough. For example, mosquitoes have a parasitic relationship with us humans. They will fly up to us and drink our blood, and we will receive a horrible itchy bite in return. Barnacles on whales are a great example of commensalism, as the barnacles really don't have an effect on the whales, but the whale provides the barnacles with a safe habitat. And of course, we can't forget the most famous form of underwater mutualism made possible by my favorite childhood movie, Nemo, between the clownfish and the anemone. The clownfish has provided a safe habitat by being immune to the anemone, and the clownfish will also defend the anemone from parasites and help bring nutrients to the anemone. And although it sounds bad, parasitism isn't always bad for the environment. It's true that parasites can choose a dominant host over another, and it could possibly lead to a decline in biodiversity, but parasites like the bleeders can also allow two species to coexist and strengthen biodiversity. For example, the bleeders live in the grassy plateau region of Subnautica, with sand sharks and spadefish. Normally, with the spadefish's upwards vision and the sand shark's tendency to attack from below the sand shark would have eradicated the amount of spadefish in the habitat. However, the bleeders keep the sand shark population in check, providing a safe space for the spadefish to thrive above where the bleeders live. This is an example of how parasites can affect food webs, as normally the spadefish would be food for the sand shark, but due to the bleeders causing a divide in their species, they aren't. A real-world example of parasitism helping biodiversity is parasitic wasps that can be found in tropical forests. These wasps will lay their eggs on large spiders, and when the wasps hatch, the larvae will actually eat the spider alive until it's dead. This sounds really brutal, and it is, but it actually regulates the spider population, who would normally be the apex predator of the insect world. This allows the spider's prey to keep a population without fear of being harmed.
Moving on to a different topic, I want to go back to earlier when I talked about the hole in the ozone layer near Australia causing coral bleaching. Now, we went over that and its effects on the environment, but we never talked about how it was created. Human involvement releasing gases like chlorofluorocarbon is what really causes this damage to our atmosphere. We can observe multiple examples of outside involvement destroying the planet 4546b in Subnautica as well. First, we have the obvious example. I already talked about it, but the Aurora crash destroyed a large portion of the safe shallows, allowing apex predators to invade and take over an entire habitat. This not only shows direct destruction, but introduction of an invasive species, like the Reaper Leviathan, into an ecosystem which further destroyed the crash zone. We can see this in invasive plants and species that humans often bring into new environments, like how the lionfish, which is native to Asian reefs, have now come over to American reefs near Florida and are decimating the biodiversity of Florida's coral reefs. This is all without mentioning the Aurora's radiation that was introduced into the safe shallows, which will surely ravage the environment around the Aurora for hundreds or thousands of years. Although the habitat may be able to endure and rebuild similar to how the habitat has around the Chernobyl exclusion zone in real life. Humans also use up resources at an alarmingly fast rate. The resources you use on 4546b are only limited, and the game doesn't hide the fact that your tools are made from processed materials which are made from tons of natural resources that could take thousands of years to repopulate. We also have the alien involvement of the precursors, who brought the coronavirus to 4546b in the first place, a virus that's killed multiple different species and is still ravaging across the planet. Us humans have done very similar things before. Normally, a species from one part of the world will likely have built up antibodies to the diseases around their environment, but creatures from other parts of the world are still completely vulnerable to these diseases. For example, when colonists brought mosquitoes and water from other plants to the waters of the New World, when the Americas were discovered, a whole host of water and bloodborne illnesses were introduced to the native populations, like malaria, smallpox, typhus, and influenza, along with the whooping cough. These diseases almost eradicated tons of native populations, and hunting practices mixed with these diseases drove bison and elk to near extinction. Although Subnautica is based underwater, there are land components to the game, and believe it or not, land and sea ecosystems do depend on each other. In Subnautica, we find key examples in the fact that the mountain island is only capable of sustaining life because of the multiple underwater thermal vents shooting up nutrients into the caves inside the island, which over time the cave crawlers have used to bring nutrients up to the surface in different forms, creating the lush tropical island we see in the game. Just like the cave crawlers in Subnautica, there are many species that exist both on land and in the ocean, like mangrove trees, seals, penguins, and turtles to name a few. These animals give a little bit of insight into the relationship between land and sea ecosystems. Oceanic habitats also depend on the land habitats for nutrients brought into the water by rain runoff. If an aquatic system were to die off, land animals would lose food and both habitats would die. If a land habitat were to die, all the nutrient runoff would likely cause an overgrowth of algae, causing starvation of light, warmth, and nutrients to the water habitat below, causing it to die as well. Just like in real life, creatures in Subnautica evolved due to changing conditions in their habitats, just like how the stalker eventually evolved into the snow stalker, or how this tropical holefish eventually evolved into the holefish from below zero, evolving to carry more oxygen and becoming larger to sustain itself in sub-zero climates. There's also the peeper, who evolved to become the Reginald in the grassy plateau. Due to the lack of physical food in this habitat, the peeper evolved to filter nutrients from the water around it. And finally, the Reaper Leviathan evolved to use echolocation in dark environments. There are also animals in real life that have evolved their habitat, like the penguins and clownfish I mentioned before. There's also animals like the thorny devil lizard, which have evolved to make its scales channel rainwater directly into its mouth, and has also evolved to have desert camouflage. And speaking of camouflage, many northern mammals, like the snowshoe hare and minks, have evolved to shred their gray summer coat for a white winter coat in the winter to blend in easier with the snow. This is similar to how the polar bear has evolved to have a permanent white coat for the same reason. Now, conclusions are never easy, but I want to end off by reminding everyone that Subnautica is a truly beautiful game, and I firmly believe that part of its beauty is not only in how it creates an entirely new world, but how it bases itself off of real-world concepts that we can learn from and apply to the real world. Although this game is creepy and fun and has an amazing story, it's truly the best at being immersive. It creates an amazing world for us to explore and live in. Not only do we learn something new about the game, but we learn more about our own planet as well, and that is amazing. It's going to be about a year until Subnautica 2 releases, but until then, I will be perfectly content with this masterpiece of a game. Have a good one.